Welcome to a joint webinar from the Oak Woodlands and North Atlantic Fire Science Exchanges/Consortia. I just want to give a very brief introduction to the Fire Science Exchange Network. So, many of you are aware that the Fire Science Exchange Network is part of the Joint Fire Science Program. The North Atlantic is up here in the northeasternmost corner of the United States. We also are fortunate to get to collaborate with our Canadian colleagues on the other side of the border, but within the same ecosystems. And brought to you today by the Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium. We get to team up with Oak Woodlands for today's webinar. These Fire Science Exchange networks are busy across the country trying to connect fire science and help fire science to inform management and to help land management boots on the ground expertise inform fire science. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Dr. Smithwick, I would love if you could start sharing your screen. And I'm going to read just a very brief bio of Dr. Smithwick to help you all for today. So again, welcome to today's webinar on Firescapes of the Mid-Atlantic, Challenges and Opportunities for Implementing Prescribed Burning as a Land Management Strategy. Dr. Erica Smithwick is a distinguished professor of geography at the Pennsylvania State University, USA. She is an associate director at the Institutes of Energy and the Environment and director of the Center for Landscape Dynamics. Currently, she is an administrative fellow in the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research. She also served as a Fulbright Scholar in South Africa at Rhodes University. Her laboratory group, LEAPS, Landscape Ecology at Penn State, leaps.psu.edu, is actively involved in understanding how fires and climate shape landscapes and how we can use that understanding to support socio-ecological resilience. This research is conducted in the Mid-Atlantic, Wisconsin, Alaska, South Africa, and Kenya. Dr. Smithwick, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to share about our project. Thanks to Amanda and Virginia and Joe for organizing this. My entry point into fire work, shall we say, was first in Zambia, doing prescribed burning there, and then also in Yellowstone for many years, where I've continued to work off and on with my collaborator, Monica Turner, and others, looking at wildfire in the West. I've also looked at fire in Alaska. Right now, though, for the past decade or so, I've been really excited to engage in work in the Northeast. I'm actually from Massachusetts, so it's actually really nice in many ways to be coming home and really kind of taking my experiences elsewhere to this landscape. And as you'll find out, this is a really interesting place to be thinking about putting fire intentionally back onto the landscape. So the work I'm about to present was funded through the Joint Fire Sciences program and was very collaborative. So the other co-authors you see here on the slide are coming from a number of different departments at Penn State. And not shown here, but very critical to our work were postdocs and graduate students who also contributed, you'll see their names throughout the presentation, to this effort. One of the things I'd like to emphasize is how interdisciplinary this project was. I think you'll see by the nature of our methods and our approach just how much this needed to be a team science approach. This is not a fire ecologist doing this work. It's not a geographer doing this work. It's not a social scientist doing this work. It's a team effort. And I think, a place like Penn State, where we do a lot of interdisciplinary research, we really have a lot to give to the fire management community and vice versa, because this project did not begin with scientists. It began with management questions. And so I'd like to, my pitch that I'll start with and hopefully end with is that there's a lot more opportunity for these kinds of collaborations. And it'd be nice to see that infused more broadly into fire research. Okay, without further ado, I promised Amanda that this would be short, so we'd have lots of time for questions. So I did intentionally try to keep this short. This is a Marshall Fire. You all are aware of what recently happened outside of Boulder just within the last week or so. And I'm showing this. I could show many pictures of fire, obviously. This one is taken from a headline from NBC News. It just amplifies and exemplifies the importance of looking at the intersection between social systems and natural systems. And again, the importance of an interdisciplinary lens when we're trying to think of managing fire appropriately on the landscapes in order to promote more resilient landscapes. So you all are probably aware of this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I just want to emphasize that this was our starting point, not at the end of the project, but at the beginning of a project. How can we integrate the social sciences and the natural sciences and beyond to actually support decision-making for effective fire management? So why the Mid-Atlantic? It seems a lot of you are from the Northeast or obviously close by, so many of you are familiar with this, but I just want to emphasize the differences in this region compared to where a lot of the money and the attention goes out west, and necessarily so. But we have a really interesting landscape here. In Pennsylvania specifically, if you just sort of focus in on this rectangle, you see the complex land uses, land ownerships here within our state, within our region. This is not just the red is federal lands, the green is sort of private lands, and then you see state, and particularly in Pennsylvania, you see this really interesting mix of state and private lands in this region. And that's true across much of the East. The image at the bottom is by Volker Radeloff, and you'll see here his work showing the wildland-urban interface. And the higher the levels of the WUI, the more the orange you see. And of course, again, rightfully so, we pay a lot of attention to the WUI in the West, but there's a lot of WUI in the East. Now, we're not as concerned about it in many ways in the wildfire risk area because our hazard is a little bit lower than the West. But in some places, that's not true. And we also worry about it in terms of putting prescribed fire on the landscape safely and so that smoke and other concerns aren't an issue. So there's lots of reasons why the East is different than the West. And yet, as you see there, you probably already read it, but we don't have a lot of social science studies about how to implement fire in the East. Most of that work has come in the West. And thus most of that work too, until recently, has been focused on wildfire and not prescribed fire implementation. So not a lot of social science in the East, and particularly not a lot of social science focused on prescribed fire management. That is changing, but again, not a lot of work happening out in this area. So our project began with the hypothesis that the public beliefs and perceptions about prescribed fire are shaped by experience and exposure. This is sort of the null hypothesis that perhaps in the East, there would be different levels of exposure to fire than the West, although we didn't include the West in this particular study. But even within this region, people would have different amounts of awareness and experience with prescribed fire and different motivations or understandings of why one would put fire on the landscape. So we use a mixed methods approach. I mentioned trailhead surveys here. That was our primary focus, but as you'll see, we used a variety of different methods to explore these patterns across this landscape. We focused on New Jersey and Pennsylvania. We also included Maryland to a certain degree, although I won't be talking about that today. So if you look at Pennsylvania and New Jersey, one thing to really highlight that motivated our study, frankly, and to highlight here is the difference between the history of prescribed burning. So Pennsylvania only began burning in 2009, essentially, when there was the Prescribed Burning Practices Act that limited liability for putting prescribed fire on the landscape. So when we proposed our study, the prescribed burning had only been going on for 8 or 9 years. So this is a relatively new practice, compared to in the New Jersey Pinelands, where there's a much longer history of putting prescribed fire back on the landscape. So here immediately we have different timelines just in the Mid-Atlantic. And again, these are only 4 hours from each other, door to door, at least where I'm at in the State College. And so you have very different histories of putting fire on the landscape and vegetation types as a result. So these changes in policy are interesting because we immediately then think about social systems, how those policy changes are influencing what managers are able to do on the landscape, how that controls and governs what they're able to do, their capacity for implementing fire, even with policy that's on the table. And on the image on the I guess the right shows the rapid uptick in that burning practice after the change in policy in 2009. This is just in Pennsylvania, and I know it's a bit outdated. Pennsylvania has basically flattened, as far as I'm aware, since then, due to COVID and weather issues over the past couple years. But basically 15,000 acres burned a year. If people know different, please let me know. But the point is not so much this, but the rapid uptick, right? How fast we're putting fire on the landscape, relatively speaking, in this area. So at this point, and again, about the time our project was funded in 2015, 2016, managers are starting to ask, well, are communities concerned about this, that this is a relatively new practice? Are we doing this the right way? Are we engaging communities the right way? How else can we be approaching this challenge? And of course, in New Jersey, that's not the case so much because there has been a lot of focus on prescribed burning, as I mentioned before, but even on wildfire hazard, because the wildfire risk is higher. This middle picture is a burn that actually did happen during our project time period. The image on the left is a picture from Rolling Stone magazine. Obviously a bit dramatic, but not outlandish, right? Showing that in 24 hours, you can have a wildfire spread from the coast very far inland with significant amounts of damage. So there's rightfully a strong attention on reducing fire hazard in New Jersey. And the New Jersey Forest Fire Service, who we worked with in our project, is very focused on that effort. But of course, there are many other reasons for burning in both of these landscapes. In Pennsylvania, in particular, one of the main motivations for burning is habitat restoration and particularly game management. So it's a Pennsylvania Game Commission that implements most of the burning on state game lands. And so restoring pitch pine, this is actually the pitch pine ecosystem here in the Scotia Pine Barrens, just behind Penn State, is actually a place where they've put out several prescribed burns since 2009. And there would be my dogs. I was hoping they'd be quiet, but they weren't. So apologies. And the other component of this is oak restoration. So in Pennsylvania, we have these pitch pine stands, we have pine barrens, but we also have a lot of mixed oak stands. So unlike in New Jersey so much, there's a real focus on oak restoration and removal of red maple, for example, from the understory. I'll say more about that in a minute. So our study objectives were many, and so there's a lot, so bear with me. But the first couple objectives were around those community and social perceptions, assessing the community and manager perceptions about prescribed fire benefits and concerns. So I have focused kind of on the community, but we're also really focused on what managers were concerned about, right? And how do those compare? In our third objective, we wanted to quantify those fire effects themselves. Was the burning that was happening already in Pennsylvania effective? So this is sort of more traditional post-fire burn monitoring. Our fourth objective was to explore the consequences of repeated and single burns on forest structure and carbon storage through modeling with FVS FFE to really look at longer periods of burning and sort of forecasting forward, if you will, if that's not redundant, the effects of multi-year burning, because we obviously don't have long periods of repeated burning on the landscape now. So can we use a model to try to understand those trajectories moving forward and try to understand at what level of fire return interval would be most effective? And then our fifth objective was to identify some mismatches, or I'd actually like to talk about it now as synergies, opportunities for looking at the benefits to people who are using the forest, to recreational users, people who care about the forest, as well as to managers. And can we use that information to better determine an optimal burning period? So I'll say more about all of this in a second. So all of that could be simplified in this Venn diagram, which is to say we know there are changes in the ecosystem. We want to understand that through monitoring. We know there are issues in the, perceptions, beliefs, perhaps issues, challenges in the community. We want to understand those through a variety of methods. And then we also understand there are objectives that managers have. And these objectives might differ depending on the agency, depending on the objectives of that agency. And so we need to think more comprehensively about how these overlap. And we're really interested in this sweet spot here, where we can start to understand where things are aligning, or maybe more importantly, where they're not aligning, so that we can shed light on what might need to change in the system to make it be more resilient. So again, our study area, we're primarily focused just generally in this boxed area in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And I mentioned that we did include Maryland. We also have some focus groups from Maryland of managers that we also included. Our monitoring work was really focused in the Scotia Pine Barrens just behind State College, where we had these mixed oak and aspen oak stands. And these, again, were managed by the Pennsylvania State Game Lands. So we had focus groups. We had focus groups with managers in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, included Nature Conservancy and other agencies, as well as state agencies. We also had trail intercept surveys. So we would have students waiting at the entrance of a trail and be ready with an iPad and ask users who would wander by some questions about their awareness of burning, about their perceptions about burning. We also collected data in that time period about how much they valued the forest and for what kinds of qualities. We showed them pictures of different forests, and particularly those pictures of the forest were at different times since fire. And we asked them to rate them and rank them. And through this, we were able to understand how much they were, in many ways, willing to pay for a certain kind of attribute for a forest. And I'll go into that in a minute. We did the post-fire monitoring, we did the modeling, and then we also did something called environmental economics modeling. My colleague, Catherine Zip, used an equation that's very common in forestry called the Faustman's rotational problem. And I'll say more about that. We're not going to go into math today. Don't sweat it. I know it's just after lunch. Don't worry. But basically, we optimize the fire return interval to maximize the benefits. And so we wanted to understand how to do that without losing opportunity to have an impact on the ecosystem. Okay, so I'm going to go straight into some findings. I'm happy to talk more about methods afterwards. But here's what we found. In those aspen oak stands in the Scotia Pine Barrens, we were seeing an effect, immediate effect post-fire of the burning effectiveness. So over the short term, which is just a couple years following burning, we're showing a decline of red maple, that's those orange or red bars, in the seedling stage, and an increase in the oak, black oak, and white oak. Little less of a difference in the saplings, but some encouragement that at the seedling level, at least in terms of regeneration, we were seeing an impact of this. In terms of our modeling work, I'm spend a little more time on this slide because there's a lot going on. If we were to go back, again, we only have a one-time slice to go back and look at the field experiments, but here we're now able to monitor repeated burns over many intervals. So here, and multiple different ecosystem types. So here in the left-hand column, these are all oak dominant stands. In the mixed oak forests, we have, well, mixed oak stands, and then we have oak pine and mixed species. And then reading from left to right and going down, we have completely unburned. So if we didn't burn a stand at all, to having a single burn and then no more burns for the next 60 years, having a 20-year fire return interval over 60 years, a 10-year fire return interval over 30 years, a 10-year fire return interval over 60 years, all the way down into a 5-year fire return interval over 60 years. So you can see kind of the difference. Now the purple is the live biomass. You can kind of just focus on that to see the biggest changes. Obviously, if we don't burn, there is an increase in live biomass. And here we're also graphing this as carbon. They're similar though, of course, right? And so here without burning, obviously the forest is growing and you're getting more biomass and more carbon. Very little effect of having a single burn on total biomass and carbon as well. You're starting to see an effect, however, if you burn every 10 or 20 years, you're starting to see an impact on the carbon storage of that ecosystem. If you go all the way down to the 5-year fire return interval for 60 years, you're actually seeing a loss of carbon. Anything below the dotted line is essentially a loss of carbon from the initial state. So not shown here, but what we also saw in the modeling results was that you were getting restoration of the species that were desirable, sort of the oak species in the model. But what we're showing here is that if you do a very short interval, there might come at a trade-off where you're actually losing carbon. So you might lose carbon in your system, but you might gain the objective of restoring your oak pine ecosystem, for example. So depending on your objective, you might have different amounts of fire return interval that would be desirable. Okay, then what did we find from our surveys? Well, first let's look at the benefits. And here we're going to compare, I didn't mention that we also did a survey with managers as well. So as well as the trailhead surveys, we also sent out a survey online to managers. So we can now compare managers and forest users or recreationalists. And we can also compare recreationalists in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So we can also split out managers across the two, but we're going to lump them here for this purpose. So at the apex of the triangle or the pyramid here is the variable that had most influence. Every time there's a line, there was a significant difference of what was seen to be the most benefit for prescribed burning. So if we ask recreationalists, what is the potential benefit of prescribed burning, we gave them a choice. Tick reduction was always top of the list. If we asked managers what the difference was, lower wildfire risk was at the top of the pyramid here. Tick reduction, however, was second. Wildfire risk across all recreationalists was a lot lower. We had a lot of managers respond to our survey from New Jersey, so this may be why we had slightly elevated response for wildfire risk relative to potentially in Pennsylvania. Between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, it turns out that everybody doesn't like ticks. This seemed to be, again, dominantly the most important factor for our recreational users, that they saw that as a potential benefit of putting prescribed fire on the landscape. Now, it would be interesting to talk with you afterwards. This is one direction our research is moving towards, is to really understand better the science of this. There may be people on the call who are doing some of this work. There are a few of you out there. This is still an area that's unclear, whether there's an immediate reduction in tick population, but then an increase later for a variety of reasons, including host density increases post-fire. So the science is still out on this. The point here, though, is that people perceive that as a benefit. So for better or worse, it can be used as a tool, but let's make sure that the science is right when communicating about why we're putting fire on the landscape. And secondly, it's something that we need to understand better just so we can understand where to put fire on the landscape in the most sustainable way. Noting too here that there are other factors that differed between Pennsylvania residents and New Jersey residents, and particularly around wildfire risk. So New Jersey residents were more concerned about wildfire risk than in Pennsylvania. And that may not be a surprise, but is worth understanding a bit more. Okay, now what were people concerned about? Again, same kind of graph, recreationalists versus managers. Here, managers were more concerned about spread, smoke, and health, whereas recreationalists are more concerned about wildlife mortality. And that was true across Pennsylvania and New Jersey recreational users. So I attribute that to Smokey Bear still having an influence and people being very concerned about what happens to the wildlife in these forests during or after a fire. And then other factors such as you can see smoke and health was a larger factor for folks in New Jersey compared to those in Pennsylvania, perhaps because they see smoke more in New Jersey. Okay, so putting all of that together, and frankly, these are results that we're still kind of trying to interpret ourselves. But if you want to understand support towards prescribed fire, we used a structural equation modeling approach to explore this dynamic. And so you can look at everything leading towards this purple arrow. The higher the number, the more of the effect. And you can see that there were a number of demographic factors that influence support towards fire. Their hunting experience. We have work also that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today, a paper that's published that shows that hunters actually had a greater willingness to accept fire management than non-hunters, coming out of the same survey work that we did. So hunting experience seems to be positively correlated as support towards prescribed fire. Experience with fire, awareness of fire, familiarity that it is even a thing, and people's age and so on. Then we have these bucket of factors that we're calling concerns, those that we're calling benefits, and then another that we're calling beliefs. It's not directly a concern or a benefit, but a perception about the concern or the benefit. So, we asked people whether managers should just leave forests alone, for example. And then even things about, is it acceptable for reducing fire risk? Is it an acceptable practice for habitat management? And those actually become the largest, most dominant influence on support towards prescribed fire. Not kind of which concern or which benefit, but what do they believe are the most important things about how we should be managing our forests. That being said, across both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, there was trust of fire managers to put in fire. And if you remember at the beginning, I said, we don't know how people are going to react to a new fire management practice in Pennsylvania, where it's such a new practice. Even in Pennsylvania, at least for those people that we surveyed, 40% strongly agreed that agencies know how to effectively plan and conduct prescribed burns. The number is, tips to being 30% completely agree versus 19% for New Jersey. So, more than half of the population, either in New Jersey, strongly agrees or completely agrees that managers know how to effectively implement prescribed burning. And very few would disagree. So there's some that are neutral. But I think that's a good message to carry into your fire management work. Okay, I'm going to, non-animate this. It's going to be a lot of words, but I am going to read them. Oops, sorry. I am going to read them because I think they're important. This is coming out of our focus groups. So our focus groups included managers, and it included FireWise community members who really were working in tandem with managers. And so just bear with me. I'm going to read a few of these so you don't have to squint at your screen. And ultimately what we did, we have pages and pages and pages of these quotes. And what we did is we lumped them into certain thematic areas. So for example, this first one on the upper left is about the landscape mosaic and the complexity of managing Firescapes in the Mid-Atlantic. One person said, we have a lot of interface here. We have a lot bigger population compared to out west. So we have a lot of public people, roads or homes or developments or businesses that we have to take into consideration when we burn. Everything has to be in place to be able to accommodate that population, to make sure the winds aren't affecting the smoke, all that kind of stuff, right? The challenge of putting fire on a landscape in the East. What about compliance challenges? One person said, the last 5 to 7 years, things have changed drastically in our procedures of what we do prior to putting fire on the ground. So it's gotten a lot more complicated in that matter. The whole planning process and notification process is a lot of times more difficult than actually doing the burn itself. So a capacity issue, a compliance issue within agencies and management. And what about education and awareness or perception that managers have about these challenges and dealing with the community? We do a really good job at our job that they don't even realize that we have this fire problem because we suppress it before it gets too big. So then the prescribed burning turns into the bigger event because even though we have it under control, they perceive it as a wildfire instead of a prescribed burn fire. Sort of a mixed blessing of doing your job well, or I shouldn't say mixed blessing. It's a problem to do your job too well because then people don't understand what would happen if you didn't do your job at all. Trust. It's so organized. This is a FireWise community member. It's so organized and I'm amazed. It's just amazing to watch. If you have a chance to go see one, definitely go see. They're 2 feet away from the building and it's like it's going to stop right there because of what they did. They raked, it's so organized. So I have total faith in these guys. I think they do a great job, right? Complete trust that this FireWise community member has in the fire manager. The importance of a network broker. This came up over and over again of bridging between managers and communities. And this again from a FireWise community member. When we decided to become a FireWise community, I got his number and I called him. He returned my call while he was on vacation and I was sold right then and there that he was committed. I mean, calling when he was on vacation, when I'm on vacation, my cell phone is in my pocket. He called me immediately. Every time I ask for something, he has come right back to me. So that gives us the confidence to go on, right? That sort of repeated relationship over time. That communicator that goes out of their way to bridge the communities and the management communities. Really important. And there's more. I mentioned we have a lot here. So what we've tried to do in our work is organize this. And we're starting to think about this as barriers and opportunities. So this is very relative, so don't read too much into it, but it's clear that there are opportunities for greater coordination across this system. So things that like caring, I didn't show quotes about this, but people really care for each other between these FireWise communities and the managers. Capacity. This is hard, right? But it's an opportunity. If we can give more capacity to managers, there's more that they want to do in the landscape. Social networks, that's hard and also easy. Like, we know kind of how to do it. We just have to do it. And then there are other things like at the landscape level, infrastructure. You're not going to shift infrastructure really easily. So there's very few opportunities to do that. It's expensive to do that. How do you deal with complacency? A lot of people talked about complacency in the public. We're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with climate change. Last thing we want to worry about is prescribed fire. So how do you overcome that kind of complacency? Fragmentation. I mean, there's a lot of things that are difficult to handle, and then there's other things that we can work on. So we tried to lay this out in an organized way. But the other piece of this is that all of these factors, although they're along this gradient, they really are operating at very different levels of organization within the system. So some of these are very individual level perceptions of, do I trust this person? Do I care about my neighbor? Am I afraid of fire, or afraid of what might happen to my livelihood? So fear is a big driver, but it can be considered an individual level factor. At the community level, there are things like turnover in the community, how quickly the community is on average, how long people have lived there and how much they would have had experience or sense of place of that landscape and understand the importance of fire in the landscape, or lack of importance of fire in the landscape. So that rapid turnover of communities is an issue. And that's a community level issue. That's not, it happens at the individual household level, but it manifests at the community level, and so on. And then at the landscape level, things like capacity is really about interagency coordination. Same with institutional objectives. You have many agencies operating across the same landscape with many different objectives. That has to be coordinated at a landscape level. And again, the built environment, fragmentation, land use, all of that is really a landscape level consideration. So we need to approach some of these challenges with this kind of multi-level framework. And so closing up on our results now, one of the last things we were looking at was this environmental economics approach. Really what we wanted to understand is how much value people placed on, we're going to call them structural attributes of the post-fire environment. And we just picked 3: visibility, habitat quality, and reduced fire hazard. We could have picked more, but we felt that these had surrogates in the modeling work, and surrogates that we could use in our surveys. And we also wanted to understand how those attributes, the structural features, changed with time since fire, which again, we could model this with our FVS modeling, the same modeling results that I showed earlier. We use some of those metrics in this analysis. And to put the end story up front, what we found is that the benefits could be achieved. So those attributes could be achieved in New Jersey with every 4 years, or 2 to 5 years, let's just say, post-fire. Well, it turns out that that's fairly close to what we'd like to be burning in terms of a fire return interval in a lot of our New Jersey landscapes. And in Pennsylvania, it was a longer optimal fire return interval of 10 to 20 years, which again, in most of our mixed systems in Pennsylvania, is about what managers are kind of targeting. So that's reassuring that we were sort of hitting those targets in our modeling work, and also confirming that what managers are doing on the landscapes now is also meeting the desired social benefits that the community, or at least the forest users, are perceiving or measuring themselves. So again, just to review, we have the user benefits being increased visibility. We saw that as a surrogate for hunting, for example, reduced hazard, and then increased habitat quality. Again, general wildlife concern, but also for hunting. And then forest conditions with time since fire. Our surrogates here was canopy base height for visibility, severe fire flame length for hazard, and pine oak basal area for our habitat quality. And just showing you that there's a lot behind this. We were able to estimate sort of the willingness to pay for each of those attributes across both New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Obviously, if you have low fire hazard, you'd be willing to pay more Then if you have, high fire hazard, you don't want to pay for a high fire hazard, you want to pay for low fire hazard. And the inverse for visibility, you'll pay more for having higher visibility than lower visibility. And you'll pay more for having better habitat quality than lower habitat quality. Now, this wasn't actually dollars that we're talking about. This is more, we actually use the metric of, are you willing to drive a certain amount of time to a landscape that has these features compared to one that would be closer? And then we can see through other survey work how much value they place on their time. And through that environmental economics magic, we were able to understand their willingness to pay. That becomes the metric for those attributes. And then this showing you the metrics of how those different features changed with time since fire from the modeling work. And again, not going into detail, just showing you we had that data. And then that's how we ended up, we then plugged that data into this equation to come up with these curves. We're working on that paper now. If you're interested in finding out more, I'm happy to share. I'll give you Kate's number and you can talk to her. Okay, so just to summarize, what we found overall was that in our monitoring work, the prescribed fire was meeting its objectives. In other words, at least initially, we were showing reduced red maple in the understory and support for oak and hickory seedlings. Will that continue over time? To be determined. We need to go back out and do more modeling or monitoring. In our modeling work, we also showed that repeated burning, 5 years in New Jersey, 10 to 20 years in Pennsylvania, achieves our restoration goals. With the exception that at that very high frequency burning, you are losing carbon from the landscape, potentially, if you're doing a restoration treatment from a more dense stand. We also showed with our environmental economics modeling that the user benefits, perceived user benefits with time since fire matches the forest conditions that you would find post-fire. So that's all aligning with what managers are doing on the landscape. So that's really good news. And then there's some nuance here, that the perceived benefits and risks differed somewhat between users and managers and among the states. So it's not one uniform landscape in that sense. There are differences in terms of fire history, in terms of people's experience with fire, and so on. But it does seem that people care about ticks, so we need to do some more work on that. And they care about wildlife mortality. So those need to be taken into consideration in any messaging or communications. And then there is a concern, of course, about fire spread. All of these barriers and managers are multi-scaled and need to account for individual, community, and landscape level patterns. I'm not going to read that. That's basically what I just said, all of those major findings. So I'm just going to close with this caveat, which is that there are both similarities and differences across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So Pennsylvania, this more recent fire compared to New Jersey, in general, the experience with prescribed fire was pretty similar across the region, where they have some experience with it. And then their drivers for forest visitation was pretty similar across all of them. Habitat quality was really important, for example. These are examples of some of the pictures. Almost everybody liked this image, this 1 year post-burn image. And they didn't like this pre-burn image, actually. And it perhaps because it didn't look like something you could walk through easily or go hunting or do your recreational activities. So there was some similarity in how people kind of perceived that. And there was also, but there were differences. So I am familiar with prescribed fires. In New Jersey, that was very true for 33% of the people, but only 2.6% of the people were very familiar with prescribed fires in Pennsylvania. So there's still an awareness difference. And this is how frequently do you follow fire management activities? And very few people do. I guess that's not a surprise, but some of them, monthly, a few times a year. We have a surprising number of people that we ran into who kind of had heard about this in our at least central Pennsylvania landscape that we were monitoring. So that's kind of interesting. So things to keep in mind in terms of interpreting these results. So I'd like to suggest that we need more monitoring in these systems to really understand. I mean, these systems grow back really fast. We need to understand if we're achieving the ecological goals. We need to understand all sorts of other factors, the role of invasives, things you all probably think about quite a bit. We also need to develop a multi-level landscape burning strategy where we can think about individual values, communities, agencies. And I'd like to suggest too that we have to continue to monitor community acceptance. Attitudes can shift. I mean, we just had a pandemic following this. Maybe people's value of being outside is different than it was beforehand. How do we understand changing community acceptance? It should be entrained into how we are implementing our processes. And then we need enhanced manager capacity and flexibility. It's probably no surprise to many of you to meet these objectives, maintain community relationships, expand to private land areas, and adapt to changing systems, particularly under changing climate conditions. So all of those things. And I think I may be out of time. I'll look to my timekeepers, Amanda and Virginia. I'd like to leave a lot of time for questions. Oops, I'm gonna go. So I guess I'll just refer you to our webpage, which has a link to a couple videos in there. One of them is created by WPSU, and it's a really nice summary of some of our community, the importance of including communities in prescribed fire management. There's also a little sort of more tutorial video about about our project and what we're trying to accomplish in the project. So I highly encourage you to watch those, to share those. They might be particularly useful for Firewise communities. If you have them in your area, that was our intention, that they could be shared to Firewise communities as a way to kind of think about that relationship. So I will stop there, and hopefully we have enough time for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Smithwick. That was an incredible, incredible explanation of so much research, years of research that have gone into a 40-minute presentation. Amazing.
It's a lot there, so I'm sure I skipped over some things. So.
No, you gave us an overview, and yeah, this is fantastic. So we have a couple of questions that are coming into the chat window. A quick one about ticks. Bill is asking, so is it unknown whether prescribed fire reduces tick populations? And Joe Marshall did put a link to a research brief into the chat window, but I wonder if you can just speak to that very briefly. I know that wasn't the focus of your research here, but.
Yeah, I mean, in our area, the truth is we don't really know in Pennsylvania. There is work being done in the New Jersey Pine Barrens right now, and it turns out there's some non-linearities. So there may be an initial, the fire itself, but then it sort of peaks again a couple years after. And I don't want to misinterpret that result. Jesse Cry and others are working on that. We're actually working with an entomologist now to kind of understand those dynamics. In Pennsylvania, we really don't know. Most of the work is happening down a little further south in sort of the Virginia area. And as far as I understand, there is some initial decline, but what I mentioned about that then potentially coming back. Now, the other interesting thing is what kind of tick. So New Jersey has black-legged ticks and, Lone Star. I'm new to the tick world, so I'm learning about ticks. But there are different ticks let's put it that way, in New Jersey versus Pennsylvania. So we don't even know if the ticks are responding in the same way to the same factors. That's the bottom line. So we really need to engage with our entomologists for helping us to understand that. I have a graduate student, and she and I are learning together. And so I welcome your insights on that, because we're planning to have her go out in the field in the Pennsylvania region to do some tick surveys, and particularly to target some post-fire environments. So hopefully more to come on that. But yeah, please share what you know with me. Please reach out to me separately. I'd love to, we're learning more.
Great, thank you so much for that. Let's see, another question. Philip is asking, can you explain the significance, importance, or negative outcomes as a result of lost carbon in these forested systems post-fire?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why do we care about carbon, right? Now, it depends on your perspectives. So there are a lot of agencies that are now managing for enhanced carbon sequestration within natural systems. From my perspective, this is not going to get us out of an emissions problem that we have from carbon, because these forests grow slowly. But it is a strategy that we have in our toolbox to reduce the negative effects of climate change. So enhancing those systems for carbon can have many co-benefits too, because you are increasing biomass. You might be also increasing biodiversity. You might also be increasing habitat quality. So carbon is a surrogate for some of those other attributes, but primarily on its own, it can be really useful for mitigating against climate change. But it depends on your agency's objective, and that's why I put it out there. If really what we want to do is have sustainable ecosystems that are resilient to a wildfire that might burn all that carbon off, then that small risk or that loss of carbon may be a small risk that you're willing to take relative to restoring a healthy ecosystem that is less prone to wildfire. So you have to weigh all of those pieces.
Yes, I fully agree. And it's complicated. There's never just one objective that you can, that checks all the boxes for everything. A related question, and again, tying carbon and prescribed fire to wildfire, Jason is asking, considering carbon release and prescribed burning, was there any thought regarding how increased prescribed burning intervals may ultimately increase carbon release in the case of a catastrophic wildfire? So a little bit of nuance in that question.
Yeah, the carbon, I don't think the carbon emissions themselves were included in our calculations of carbon loss in that modeling work. That's a good point. I need to go back and double check with my colleague on that, but I'm pretty sure that was not included in our net carbon flux values. But in that system, well, there would be declining carbon emissions with, because you'd be having declining fuels. So assuming you have the same fuel emissions factors, consistently, that you would actually have reduced fuel loads. So each time you burn, you'd be burning off a little less carbon. But you would be having more and more burns. And so that would ultimately, not only are you reducing the total stock of carbon, but you're also reducing the amount, or you're enhancing the amount of carbon that's released by the prescribed burn. That being said, what I just replied to in the other question remains true, that if you were to get a massive catastrophic wildfire, then yes, then you're kind of back at ground zero. So that's really the concern. I think what's really important in these conversations to keep in mind is what's the initial state? How much carbon is in your system now? Because a lot of these systems have a lot of carbon now, and any kind of restoration activity that would get them to a pitch pine stand or something like that, that would be a very large loss of carbon. But for some systems, it's not that big of a change. So it really depends. What's your starting point? What's your goal? And then, thinking about the resilience of the forest to future threat, what is your future fire risk potential, and how much are you going to weigh that into your decision making across those different strategies?
Great answer, thank you. And just a quick plug, again, on the topic of carbon and smoke as sort of a surrogate for carbon release, we have a fueling collaboration panel discussion series happening next week. The topic is on smoke is not just smoke. So, how do you want your smoke? Would you rather have it in a controlled, maintained, managed, prescribed fire, or would you rather have it in a catastrophic wildfire? So there's a lot of nuances and elements to weigh here. You have another question. A participant is asking, or first they say, thank you for your presentation. As you were conducting literature reviews and collating material to aid in data interpretation, what were some information gaps that you consistently encountered that you feel would have helped guide or support your analysis or findings?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, certainly about ticks. That definitely, we didn't have enough there. Even wildlife generally, how wildlife are going to respond. In a lot of our conversations, even with managers, how snake nesting habitat was going to be affected and the timing of burns relative to those sort of habitat requirements of the species. There seemed to be no consensus. It was kind of anecdotal. And so it was really difficult for there to be a guiding principle. It was very species specific of what that manager or that person knew about that particular habitat and that particular species. So sort of an overarching guiding principle on that. That may exist. I'm just saying it didn't come up in our conversations. Let's see, what else? I'm sure there's a lot more. I mean, there's really in Pennsylvania, we don't know much at all. Fire histories. We don't have a lot of fire histories. People in this group actually have done the most work in sort of fire history in this landscape. And that's just a function of the fact that we don't have a lot of lakes and we don't have a lot of landscapes that have remained following deforestation to give us tree scarves. And so we have a difficulty understanding the past history, sort of the role of indigenous burning, and how to contextualize our objectives now relative to those past conditions. We think we know, but we're interpreting on very few data points really within this area specifically. So we're making some assumptions and generalizations. So that's just important caveat. I'm not sure there's much we can do about that yet, although if there's new methodologies or new data that creeps in, that would be very helpful, I think, for guiding these management approaches.
Great, thank you. Yes, fire history is a whole other webinar-worthy topic, but thanks for raising that. So another question is more about kind of the ecological benefits that you looked at in your study. So Marilyn says, thank you for an excellent and interesting talk. I work in the New Jersey Pine Barrens and I'm familiar with prescribed fire, but I learned a lot. I was wondering about the impact of repeated burns on the duff layer. It was a bit hard to read the charts, but it looked like the 10 to 20 year interval impacted the duff, which is where insects overwinter, is necessary for the germination of some seedlings, etc. Was this something you looked at in a little more detail?
Yeah, that would be in that paper. I would have to go back and look at that specifically. I would say that it didn't come up as something that was seen, at least as in our cursory look, as anything that was alarming to us in terms of duff going away, at least in this part of the area. So we focused a lot on the central Pennsylvania area, and in this particular work, less on the Pine Barrens in some of that modeling. So I'd have to go back and check where that duff, I could go back and look at that figure right now, but where it was most impactful. So maybe get in touch with me. I can go look at that a bit more closely. But honestly, as a modeler, I would be a little concerned that we're not modeling it correctly anyway. So I might suggest that we actually look at some of the monitoring data. I know there is some in New Jersey and in other places, but you're raising a really good point that we really need to think about the soil quality, soil health, in addition to this. Most of my work in Yellowstone actually was on soil biogeochemistry and prescribed fire. So we were looking at nutrient cycling. I wasn't looking at invertebrates so much, but really thinking about those systems. Those are canopy fire systems, and those systems spread through the canopy at a wildfire environment. And the heating in the soil layer is pretty minimal in a natural fire system. But some of these burns we're getting out west now that are not sort of traditional canopy fires. I mean, these are infernos, right? And they really are also getting to the duff layer, and you're ending up with these blackened landscapes. So, and then thinking about what kinds of regeneration strategies are needed by those seedlings. We are in sort of new territory for fire ecologists for understanding even tree regeneration, let alone more holistic habitat restoration. So I'm sorry, that wasn't a very clear answer. I'm sorry, but that's a good question and certainly deserves more attention.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's another good topic to dive into at another point. Some of it might depend on the seasonality also of when does that prescribed fire happen and how does that affect germination, et cetera. So a good point for more research. We have just a few minutes left. I'm wondering, Dr. Smithwick, do you have any final thoughts or some synergies or surprises that emerged as you were conducting this research with your team?
Well, I will say, we were originally framing this as a mismatch study. Where are there mismatches across, geographic ranges, across communities, across managers, across modeling approaches? And we found more synergies. We found that, people were sort of the perceptions of what people wanted from their habitat was acceptable based on what managers were burning now. And so it was a little more validating of current approaches, like keep going, than we thought, which is really great, I think. And so what we are hoping for is that this information can be used to support the fire management community moving forward, supporting more engagement with communities. I think there's a lot of work to be done in Pennsylvania. Our surveys really were focused on the central Pennsylvania area. And so there's a lot in other parts of the state. It's a big state. And so I think we need to understand more diversity of perspectives there. But that being said, I think that it's really exciting time to be engaging in this work. And I sort of a plug, we want to think about what the next phase of our project is. So if you have some ideas or would like to collaborate, definitely reach out to me, because we're sort of thinking about next steps and would welcome your thoughts.
Awesome, thank you. You were so efficient at answering that. And I don't see an additional question. I will sort of follow up on what you said.
Yeah.
So back under finding 3, when you're talking about beliefs, you said that beliefs were more important than concerns or benefits. How might this finding inform strategies for increasing support for prescribed fire as a land management strategy? So, for example, like promoting trust and care and overcoming complacency, since you found more synergies than you expected.
Yeah. Well, this is consistent across any sort of hard environmental challenge. I am doing some work in communication around climate change, and it's the same thing, right? Meet people where they're at, right? Don't just tell them the facts. Here are the facts, man. You know, that does not work. We've seen this over and over and over again, whether that's cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, whether that's, combating climate change, whatever it is, that strategy doesn't work. The strategy that works is engagement with people and understanding those values and understanding where you can achieve the management objectives you want by aligning them with the values. And I don't think that means that you have to change your objectives, and it doesn't mean they have to change their values. It just means you have to better align the two. And where there are difficulties, then it's an opportunity for learning and growth both ways. And so we're actually engaging in work here at Penn State with graduate students in a process where it's really called transdisciplinary work now, where you're starting projects working with stakeholders from the very beginning. And stakeholders is a funny word. What does that really mean? It's not just managers, though. It's also the community members whose land is affected by those management decisions. So how do we better bring community members into the decision-making spaces so that there's buy-in, but also and co-learning and co-design of the project? And the problem is that takes time. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes flexibility. It takes capacity. We don't have any of that stuff right now. Heavens. So it's really hard, but I guess that's just a plug that it's important when it happens. And we've and I think frankly can be rewarding. I mean, even in doing this research, it was rewarding to be in spaces where community members were allowed to talk about their perspectives on this whole fire thing. And so I think creating more opportunities for that dialogue would be really, really exciting moving forward.
Awesome, thank you. So everybody who's still here, please join me in a round of virtual applause for Dr. Smithwick for a really, really fantastic presentation and Q&A session. Thank you on behalf of the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange and the Oak Woodlands Fire Science Consortium as well. We look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Everybody stay safe out there. Thank you.